Did you hear what the Ukrainian military is using against the Russians? I mean, look, don't get me wrong. I am all about preventing wars. But hey, if you are stuck fighting one, you have to use whatever method you can to defend. Ukraine has got the most feared, brutal, and savage country scrambling in panic, all with one ancient weapon
that target Russian forces as far as 43 miles away.
I cannot even imagine how pissed off the Russians are with the Ukrainian military after this. Curious? Keep on watching to find out what new creative ways are being used in the ongoing conflict. Number 9, the Caltrops. This primitive tool looks like the junk you throw out of the house, but in reality, it is the one weapon that changed the fate of the war for the Ukrainians. It is bizarre, it is ancient, but it is extremely deadly. The jagged iron, also known as the caltrop, was used by the Romans back in 330 BC. That's not just old, that's ancient. More than 2,000 years old. Where nobody would even think to go that far into the past. The Ukrainians hit the jackpot with this weapon. But just because it is old doesn't mean the weapon isn't useful. Even Alexander used it in his time. What exactly is it though, and what does it do? The caltrop is a simple piece of metal with 4 sharp ends. A secret weapon that can render the entire army useless. At least, that was the story back in the day. But what really left me hooked on the incredible weapon is its easy use. No matter how you put it down on the ground, one edge will always be standing up, but its dark secret lies in its attack. The end of the caltrop is so sharp that it would be enough to send the soldier wailing in pain. What the armies would do was dig up a small chunk of land, fit these inside, and let the sharp end do its nasty little job, piercing straight into the hooves of animals and feet of soldiers. The entire army would halt to a stop once this weapon sprung into action. Sometimes, even battalions of men would become useless on the ground, getting infections from the stab and dying a slow death. It was lethal, to say the least. The armies didn't even have to rub poison over these sharp ends. The knife-like stab was so effective that everybody feared walking on land. But the new use of caltrops is different. The way Ukrainians have used these primitive tools isn't to kill the Russian troops. I mean, they have no problem in killing the Russians, the way I have seen it. But the caltrops simply halt the opposition in their tracks and leave them open to the battle fire. And that's more than enough for the Ukrainians. All they wanted to do was pull off this nasty surprise for the Russians. And they did. The Russian troops couldn't even spot the edges creeping out of the ground and failed to stop before this almost invisible barrier. You can imagine what happened next. All the armored vehicles were left with their tires blown in the middle of the battle, open to fire, and vulnerable in combat. But seeing how effective the caltrops turned out to be for the Ukrainian military, they decided to take it up a notch and get a bit creative. Well, I would have been surprised if they didn't. They used the same caltrops, packed them all in huge deadly groups, and sent them raining down on the Russian lines from the sky. Now, this was a toxic surprise that even I couldn't have predicted. The hundreds of caltrops came falling from the sky like daggers flying at the troops. The sudden attack blew apart the tires and rendered the big bullies of war useless. Every armored vehicle that was once a beast on the battlefield turned into a sitting duck, dead weight for the Russians. Once the caltrops got the job done, there was only one thing left. Ukrainians used their cheap drones and weapons on the exposed troops and blew them off right there and then. Sometimes, the Ukrainian military didn't even have to waste their ammo on the armored vehicles. Most of the time, they would be coming at a blazing speed towards the Ukrainian troops, heads held high in arrogance. In fact, they would be coming so fast that the caltrops would tip them off of their balance. The vehicles would crash and burn. Sure, it does not always work. Sometimes the Russians hanging on to their dear lives drove away safely. But if you compare that with how many Russians they killed, the safety ratio is not even visible to where I am sitting. You would think Russians would have the money or the weapons to snatch the upper hand from the Ukrainians. The caltrops are a boring piece of metal after all. The Russians can surely turn it all around for themselves. But here's the thing, the amount of money the Russians would need to build a vehicle that could tackle these caltrops would be insane. So, I don't see them coming out of this pickle anytime soon. Isn't it crazy how this scrap of metal from the Roman era has left the entire world gasping in shock? I don't know about you, but I think this little trick might just win the Ukrainians the war. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Ukrainians didn't need to modify caltrops. But these next few weapons needed a couple of tweaks to make them stand their ground in a modern war zone. Number 8. The BMP-1. Here is a terrifying hybrid that Ukraine just started using against the Russians. But if you truly want to understand the power of this beast, I need to tell you about the BMP-1, the weapon used in the Soviet war. The BMP-1 first popped up in the mid-1960s. The idea was to have protected battle taxis, something that could protect the troops as they dived into the middle of the battlefield. But it wasn't just any boring taxi, it was like the Batmobile of that time. The vehicle that could protect and fight at the same time, even armored enemies. This was something that was missing from the previous weapons. We have come a long way, haven't we? It doesn't seem much today, but it was a big deal back then, and it impressed the military so much that they decided to keep it. Since then, it was never put away. If you look at it, the thing is so old that it could be kept in a museum. Look at how the world's changing. It is a surprise the infantry fighting vehicle is still in the works today. But here's the thing. Ukraine upgraded it, tricking the Russians into thinking they were using some boring old tech. In reality, they had a beast in their hands that could topple the Russian troops within seconds. For starters, they threw away the old and battered gun that could only shoot at a few hundred yards. Beyond that, it was just pure luck back in the day. If you got the target, yay. If you can't, try again. But this new power pack system is one to fear. 23mm or 30mm autocannons with 300 shells, an automatic grenade launcher with 125 grenades, and a machine gun that can send 2,200 rounds towards the enemies, scattering them away like chickens at a farm. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. What I like most about the vehicle is the anti-tank missile system, the monster tank that packs 4 dangerous missiles. Don't go for the size. These missiles are so deadly that they can tear apart any intimidating beast standing in front of the modified BMP-1. Like butter to a knife, it will strike at the top, the weakest point of an armored vehicle, and explode the enemy vehicles into rubble and dust. The badass thing is that the troops don't even have to do much. They can duck behind the armored van on their energy-absorbent seats and let the missile do its job. It won't be a pretty view, but it will be a nasty win for the Ukrainians. Another good thing about this new BMP-1 is that the guns do not shoot erratically. The Ukrainians have toned down the crazy and introduced a much more precise tracking system to the vehicle. So now, not only does the armored van's combat system shoot at a much greater range, but it also shoots the exact target, saving up on its rounds. Be it day or night, if you spot this thing on the battlefield, it is game over. There is one slight downside though. If the new and upgraded BMP-1 gets hit, the whole crew dies. But then again, that's just war, isn't it? Number 7, the flak. It is new, it is better, and it is one savage weapon. It is a pesky little thing that is sending the enemy troops into a state of utter panic. Meet the flak Panzer Gepard, also called the flak, the 60-year-old anti-aircraft gun. Made by the Germans, used by the Ukrainians, and feared by the Russians.
In the museum today, what we're going to look at is the Flak Panzer Gepard. This is a German production vehicle, so they started off in development in the late 60s.
This thing was a mighty weapon during the 1960s and 70s. It was feared so much by the enemy troops that they even gave it a cool nickname, the Flak. You'd be lucky if you didn't become victims of the Flak, the cannons that could turn any military's aerial warfare upside down. Quite literally. But the flak was shelved quite early on after the World War. In the name of military aid, Ukraine ended up getting stuck with the weapon of the past. Little did the Russians know that Ukraine would use it to tip the scales. What I think works the most for the Ukrainians is the radar system on this monster. It can lock on to the fast-moving targets within seconds and shoot thousands of yards from where it is standing. On top of its eagle-quick eyesight, there's a power-packed system on standby to leave the aerial warfare into shreds. There are 2 autocannons, each can fire at a terrifying rate of 550 rounds per minute. That's a total of 1,100 rounds per minute. No wonder the Russian troops are worried. But do you know why I am convinced that this is the best weapon the Ukrainians have right now? I saw a post where this very old and battered flak destroyed the Shahed drone to bits and pieces. The same unmanned drone that can travel at an insane speed of 1,600 miles per hour and has been giving modern tech a run for their money. The idea worked out so well for the Ukrainian military that they ended up parking this vehicle in front of all the sensitive spots. the high security areas where they cannot risk any sort of invasion. Talk about the tables turning. Number 6, T-72 tank. If there's one thing I've learned about the Ukrainians is that they refuse to give up. Ukrainians were clearly the underdogs in this war, but the way they have brought back the old weapons, flipping the table, is not something you or I can ignore. This is the T-72 tank that would have become a chapter in history if the Ukrainians hadn't decided to use it in this war. But the Ukrainians have been using this very tank as the main equipment for their battalions. It tells you a lot about how under-equipped these people are in the war zone. But just as these stories made my head spin, I found yet another crazy surprise in the mix. Turns out, most of these vehicles were damaged. Ukrainians had to take out the hull from one tank, a working turret from another, and pop them back together to get a new version of T-72 tank. It is like creating Frankenstein in the lab. But then I saw this clip and knew that Ukrainians were anything but the stooges in this war. The T-72 tank can be seen obliterating a Russian BMD-4 from no more than 30 yards away. All it took was a single tank shot and the Russians were one down in this messy battlefield. A single tank shot. No wonder they have been using this tank up front in combat. The media has started calling this the death machine, and I don't blame them one bit. If a Frankenstein-type machine can pull this off, I'm rooting for it to take away the whole battalion. Another thing that came out of this story was that the Ukrainians preferred to attack in the open. The media claims that the Russians prefer to play it safe, by staying under cover when the enemy lines are in destruction mode. But that's not the strategy of the Ukrainians. No, they want to go out like it is their last day on Earth. All in or all out. Number 5, the DIY bombs. Okay, I will be honest. This handy tool isn't a weapon from the past, but I was so impressed by the creativity of the Ukrainians that I had to show this to you. It is no secret that the Ukrainian military had to make do with what they had in the back of the room. And it wasn't a lot, trust me. So they pitched in to get a 3D printer, and that changed their entire game on the battlefield. Take this explosive as an example. All they needed was scotch tape, shrapnel, explosives, and a detonator. A primitive version of the explosive bomb. Can you guess how much this cost? A total of $10 US. Insane if you ask me. But I haven't gotten to the crazy bit yet. Did you wonder how are they getting all the ammo? They are using whatever the Russians are throwing at them. The missiles and the grenades that are old, battered, and used. The Ukrainians have cracked the code on how to recycle them and use them against their enemies. It is an absolute win-win. Here's the crazy bit. These weapons have only popped up in the last couple of days. Yet all these old weapons making a comeback isn't a big surprise. Ukraine has been known to pull off this sneaky yet neat trick in the past. They have a whole list of weapons that they keep bringing back, tweaking only a little to fool the Russian military. Take a look at this batch of weapons from the past that Ukraine used only in the last year. Number 4, the RPD light machine gun. This one weapon isn't just old, it also never made it to mass production. Can you imagine a weapon like that being even considered in the modern battlefield today? Yet, Ukrainians didn't shy away from hanging it over their shoulders and bringing it out in the war against the Russians. Let's hit the technicalities first. I bet you want to know how powerful it is in combat. All I'll say is this, you'll be surprised. The RPD has a slick system, firing at a rate of 650 rounds per minute, throwing bullets far beyond the 3,000 feet range. Seems pretty normal and boring when compared with the more popular machine guns, right? I thought that too until I read up on how it was better than them. The RPD is much lighter to carry around, and its box magazine doesn't get stuck, allowing the army to refill faster and fire even more rapidly. Especially if you are in the middle of combat, fighting at close range, you really do not want your magazine to snag. I mean, think about it. That's like taking a Ferrari on a drive and the tire blasts off halfway into the ride. It is not a pretty sight. Apart from its handy use, the RPD also had an impressive rate of fire. I am not just saying that out of the blue. The US Special Forces used these machine guns in Vietnam and claimed the same. Now, the Ukrainians didn't have any other option when it came to weapons. But this weapon that was passed down from another country is now a weapon of choice for the Ukrainian troops. Number 3, the PM1910. If we're looking at the old weapons Ukrainians are using, you won't go past the Soviet era, right? But this weapon is about 140 years old, from World War I. In the 1950s, the weapon was thrown away by the Russians. It had become outdated. at least to them. It was heavy, it was bulky, and it needed to be on the ground when putting it in combat. With its heavy weight, there's no way you can hang it on your shoulder. Some soldiers have tried lifting it up, but they have only managed to fire it from their hips. But even then, there was little to no damage done by the machine gun. So naturally, the Russians wanted better, lighter, and more effective weapons. You can call it greed or ambition, but this decision sent a couple hundred of these heavy machine guns into the back of the room, and Ukrainians got their hands on it. Now you might think, how on earth would this heavy machine gun help out the Ukrainians? Even I was shocked to find out the answer. The Ukrainians have about thousands of these heavy machine guns hidden at a secret site, yet you'll see these guns in action almost every other day. That's because the Ukrainian soldiers are a big fan of this gun. Turns out that if you have a steady supply of water, you can have an impressive firing rate running all day long. Especially when there is a heavy attack coming from the enemies, the machine gun is a savior for the Ukrainians. From the way I see it, the Maxim M1910 is the perfect weapon for the offensive side. Number 2, the AK-74. The AK-74 has been a big hit in the military for decades, but even this deadly weapon went obsolete after a while. There were far too many better options on the market. But that's not the case for the Ukrainians. Honestly, I don't even think you can guess why they prefer using the AK-74 on the battlefield. Turns out, they are extremely short on ammo. I'm sure that's not a big surprise. But here's the deal. With an AK-74 hanging on their shoulders, the Ukrainians have a better chance to find its ammo on the battlefield. Let me break it down for you. You see, the Western guns use 5.56 by 45 millimeter rounds. This specific ammo is pretty hard to find, nor is it readily available. The Ukrainians would have to ask for military aid again and again, leaving them vulnerable to the attacks by the Russians. On the other hand, the Russians use the 5.45 by 39 millimeter rounds in their own batch of guns. This specific ammo is perfectly compatible with Soviet-era guns like the AK-74. So, if the Ukrainian soldiers do run out of ammo, they can just fill up by sniffing out the ammo from the Russian soldiers. I mean, they would have to kill the soldiers so they could grab their magazines. But I don't think that's a problem in a war zone. Plus, the ammo that the Ukrainians have hiding in their storage rooms is similar to the ones they would need to refill an AK-74. So, it isn't like this old weapon was dumped over the Ukrainians. I think it has started to become one of their favorites. Number 1, the ZSU-23-4 Shilka. This is yet another example of Ukrainians bringing tools from the past and turning them into wild weaponry. Meet the ZSU-23-4 Shilka, the anti-aircraft system that was introduced back in 1960s. The system had a striking 23mm anti-aircraft mobile gun that could leave the low-flying aircraft practically useless. Back then, the system was a big hit. Today you might bring in 100 more options to replace this old anti-aircraft gun, but Ukraine only needed to make a few changes to turn it into a reliable weapon on the modern battlefield. They just needed the radar. The old system had an automatic cannon with a firing rate of 3,400 rounds per minute. But the Ukrainian version has only 2,000 rounds per minute in the bag to fire at the target. That's probably because they are saving up on ammo. But even with the lower number of rounds, this gun can be an absolute beast in the war zone, especially against drones. Don't get me wrong, with the gun in action, any chopper, drone, aircraft, or even a few ground targets could find themselves in a deadly trap. But it is most effective against drones. The only con is that these targets needed to be in close range. Otherwise, the system doesn't work. That's where the newly added radar helps the Ukrainians. They can use it to shoot targets with much more accuracy and precision, saving up on their ammo and killing off the enemies all in one go. But what I found most interesting about the system is that you can hook it up to an armored tank and force the targets to come to you. With a speed of 30 miles per hour, the Ukrainians can carry the system with them in combat. So any drone that comes flying at the army can be shot down at a close range in one go. I mean, it isn't the best option that they have right now. The ZSU-23-4 Shilka doesn't quite work as well as the other weapons that Ukrainians have under their belt. But since the Russians throw a lot of drones at them, the weapon comes in handy against those low-flying jets. So it may not be a lot, but considering what the Ukrainians have, I'd call it a win. That's all, folks. Are you surprised by how the Ukrainians are working their magic on the battlefield? I, for one, am flabbergasted. I did not expect them to turn the tables around by playing around with the ancient weapons. What do you think? Which of these weapons is your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. While you're at it, smash the like button, hit subscribe, and press the bell icon to stay updated. Thanks for watching.